Well, Bidenomics is once again leading to misery. A report today that the federal government overestimated the number of jobs created in the U.S. economy by just 818,000 between April of last year and March of this year. There you go. So almost 1 million jobs don't actually exist that they claim did. How did this happen? How did they get that so wrong? EJ Antoni is here. He's an economist at the Heritage Foundation and the in-house economist of this fine program. EJ, good to talk to you again, sir.
Vince, thanks so much for having me again.
Okay. Did you see this coming? I think you did.
Yeah, we've talked about it a few times. I mean, I wrote a piece in May, had another one in June, another in July, and another one recently just this month, talking about how all of the available data shows that the monthly job estimates we were getting month after month were just wild overestimations. And that's despite the fact that you get a jobs report 1 month, let's say in January, and then in February and again in March, you'll get revisions for the January number. And despite the fact that almost every single month was revised down by quite a bit during the 12 months that you just mentioned, despite that, it was still an overestimation, as you said, by over 800,000.
Amazing. So that's first of all, why are the people who are doing the numbers even in charge if they have to correct to the tune of nearly 1 million over the course of a year? It seems like they got it wildly off. And in fact, the organizations that estimate the revisions here, even they undervalued what was going to happen. Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo anticipated a change of 600,000. J.P. Morgan Chase anticipated a change of 360,000. And here we are, well above 800,000 jobs revised down. Why are these people within the government in charge of pulling this data together and telling the rest of us about it?
Well, what's really interesting, I think, is that if you look at some of the reports from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, for example, they also had huge downward revisions here. So it wasn't as if it's not as if essentially the people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics are in a vacuum here. They should have known better. And I think it's really interesting when we look at the last time they made these kinds of mistakes. In other words, when was the last time we had a annual benchmark with downward revisions this large? It was 2009, when the labor market was bottoming out in the depths of the Great Recession. And essentially what was happening, Vince, is conditions were deteriorating so quickly that the assumptions made by the bean counters at the Bureau of Labor Statistics didn't really make sense anymore in that economic climate. And so their estimates that they developed from those models and methodologies became wildly off. And of course, they were overestimating the number of jobs, and that's why they had to have those huge downward revisions. There's likely something very similar happening today. As just one example, the model that the BLS uses to try to estimate how many jobs are being created and lost by businesses being created and firms going out of business, that accounts for something like half of all the job gains we've seen over the last year. Here's the problem. In the post-pandemic world, a lot of the businesses that are getting started fail quickly, and even more of them never actually hire anybody. In other words, again, the assumptions we're making today, they may have made sense in 2019. They don't today. And frankly, the Labor Department at this point owes Congress and the American people an explanation of why the heck they haven't fixed anything.
Wait, are you telling me the government is not nimble and dynamic and responsive to a changing environment?
Well, only when it's politically advantageous to do so, I suppose. But, clearly right now, what's the advantage? There's none. But, if you think about it, what gets all of the news attention? The initial report.
Right.
What does not get much attention? The revisions.
Yes, and we keep seeing that. So they'll give us a rosy report, and then they revise it a month later, or in this case, an entire year's worth of jobs. We find out, no, actually, there were 818,000 fewer at least than we claimed. What does this mean for the overall economy? I know that one of the indicators that the Federal Reserve has been watching for is the more people suffer in the labor market, the higher the likelihood they might be able to drop those interest rates because, of course, it's normal people who have to suffer in order for the economy to get corrected. Also, what are the chances we're heading into a real recession or already are there?
Vince, I think there's a very good chance we're actually already in recession. We have a lot of economic indicators right now that are in the red. And the problem with when a recession begins is that just because you have 1 month of of bad data. Even if it's everything is in the red, that doesn't necessarily mean you're in a recession. You do hit those speed bumps. You get those blips on the radar. So you need several months worth of data with a very clear picture to say, okay, a recession began. So it's perfectly normal that recessions are backdated. In other words, we look back and say, okay, 5, 6, 7, 8 months ago is when the recession began. I say all that to say I think it's a very good chance we're going to look back and say sometime around August is when the recession began. Again, we have a lot of economic indicators that are already in the red. With today's benchmark, it's clear to see that the manufacturing sector has been losing jobs, not gaining them slowly, but flat out losing them. And if you add up not only all of the monthly revisions to the jobs numbers, but now throw in this benchmark as well,
Yes.
you're looking at 1.2 million jobs we thought we had over a 12-month period that were never there. That's a third of all the job growth.
A third of all the job growth is fictional. Okay. So you just said manufacturing jobs, that the official numbers up until today were that there was some slight growth, when in fact we've actually lost manufacturing jobs. So if I understand you correctly, under Lunch Bucket Joe, we have lost manufacturing jobs in America over the last year.
Well, if we go all the way back to January of 2021, when Biden and Kamala took office, you still had a lot of factories, for example, that were closed because you still had these crazy COVID measures in place, especially in some of the blue states like New York or Illinois or California. So a lot of the manufacturing job growth that we saw in the first couple of years of this administration was simply just people being allowed to go back to work.
As Trump calls them, bounce back jobs.
Right. Congratulations. It's not illegal for you to work anymore. Don't be surprised then when people start working.
Yeah.
But what we have seen since January of 2023 is the manufacturing sector has lost over 100,000 jobs. So, that's over a year and a half ago. And again, we've lost that many jobs.
But I don't know. I've been watching some of this convention this week. They claim that they've created all sorts of jobs, that jobs are coming back to America, and it's thanks to Joe Biden's presidency. Are you telling me that the math doesn't math?
Well, what's interesting is if the jobs are coming to America, so are the workers, because it's not Americans who are getting the jobs. Like you mentioned in your interview with Tucker Carlson, it's not a matter of all of these Americans are working today. They've been losing jobs. We're basically turning the American labor market into a temp agency for foreigners at this point. And it was one thing when, going back to 2019, we were adding so many jobs that we were employing not just more Americans, but more foreign-born workers as well. That's one thing. You're growing the pie for everybody. Congratulations. Today, you're simply swapping one worker for another at best.
Yeah. So in the revisions today, do they delineate between native-born and foreign-born workers in those revisions? The 818,000 jobs we are now told didn't actually exist. Did they break that out at all?
No, this is a completely different data set, actually. So we're not going to get anywhere near that kind of granularity in terms of native-born versus foreign-born. That's also why, for example, we didn't get any kind of revisions today to the unemployment rate. You would expect, well, if all these jobs aren't there, shouldn't we see, the unemployment rate revised higher? It's a different data set, Vince, and that's why we don't see that crossover there.
Okay, and then on the part-time job question that I always ask you about, what does it look like right now in August of 2024 in an election year? How many people are working now in multiple part-time job capacity to make ends meet who weren't doing that before?
We're basically flirting with record highs at this point. So from month to month, we'll have 1 month where it goes up a little, 1 month where it goes down a little, but we're essentially holding now at record highs. And this is part of the reason why we have seen this huge disparity between the number of people actually employed and the number of jobs, quote unquote, that are out there. We count a full-time job and a part-time job equally in that total. And so as you have people who lose a full-time job and then they have to take multiple part-time jobs, what happens? The number of people employed hasn't changed, but the number of jobs actually increases. Ironically, what we would usually see as a sign of wealth is increasingly showing up as a sign of impoverishment.
Let me move to some Kamala Harris proposals that I want to bounce off of you. I wanted to get your impression on. This week, Kamala Harris reportedly is proposing a corporate tax rate of 28%. She wants to increase corporate taxes. What does that do to inflation, to the cost of goods? How does that impact the average American?
Well, the corporate tax rate essentially gets passed on fully to three different groups of people. So you'll have shareholders receive a lower rate of return. You'll have workers receive lower wage growth, but then you have customers who get higher prices. And here's where it plays into the inflation that you mentioned. If these firms are having to raise their prices, corporations are charging more to customers, that shows up in the metrics as more inflation. It might not be inflation in a strictly academic sense, but to the consumer, it makes no difference. He's still stuck paying more for the same stuff.
The government imposed inflation in the form of this corporate tax rate hike, which is why, I always think, as I said earlier this week, it's muddy to say, that the corporations received a bigger share of the tax cuts than the normal middle class person. Okay, but you're paying less for goods when the corporate tax rates get cut, right?
And your wages are growing faster. I mean, the empirical evidence on this is crystal clear. And also, anybody saving for retirement, I don't care if you're a blue collar worker with a pension plan or you're somebody who's got their own, private 401k, whatever the case may be. If you're saving for retirement, I guarantee you have some money in stocks, and those stocks are not going to do as well when the corporate tax rate goes up. I mean, here's the irony, Vince. We talk about how we want to raise taxes on the rich and greedy corporations. When you raise the corporate tax rate, you end up hurting the American middle class.
Right, because those costs get passed on. Okay, so with Kamala Harris, it looks like she is also endorsing other elements of Joe Biden's recent budget proposal. That includes a tax on unrealized capital gains as income for those who with more than $100 million in notional value. Can you untangle this a little bit and what it means? So you've got unrealized capital gains are things that are valuable, but you haven't actually sold them, right?
Right. And here's the problem, Vince. Everything is worth what its purchaser will pay for it. Until the time of sale, it is pure speculation. So who the heck are you to tell me how much this is worth? Oh, and you're going to do it every December 1st, according to this proposal? Congratulations. You just assured a complete and total crash in prices across all asset categories at the end of every single year, because everyone knows that if we do this little charade where we have our sell-off and prices plummet, then everything will get evaluated by the IRS at a lower price, and therefore I won't owe as much in taxes. I mean, that's the kind of volatility, even if it's predictable, that you're going to introduce in the market with this. And furthermore, do we really want to have people being forced every year to sell off some of their portfolio in order to pay for these gains? And don't believe for 1 second that this is only going to tax the rich. They're starting at 100 million. You know what? The income tax started at the top 1% as well. And by, in literally just a few years, it hit almost all Americans. And even the tax rate on the poorest Americans was higher than the original tax rate was on the rich. So don't believe for 1 second that they're not going to come after the American middle class with this.
There is one area where it looks like Democrats are working really hard for their rich donors in blue states, though. I saw Chuck Schumer this week announce that he wants the state and local tax deduction caps to expire next year. Those caps were put in place with the Trump tax reforms, and in an effort to stop the blue states from leeching off of the rest of us. If those caps go away, won't that amount to a massive tax cut for rich Democrat donors?
That's exactly right. It's going to be a windfall to high-income earners in blue tax states. In other words, the Democrat donor class. I had a piece, Vince. I think it ran in Daily Caller, but I'm not positive. And I basically went through the numbers and showed, look, if you're a wealthy Democrat donor in a place like New York City, you're going to get a windfall for some of these folks of about $3 million a year. That's how much your overall tax burden is going to go down. Now, it's true that if we let the Trump tax cut expire, those folks' top marginal tax rate would go up, no doubt about it. But they save so much in terms of shrinking their taxable income because of that deduction that, again, it's going to save them literally millions of dollars a year.
Right. And what that means is they're not funding the profligate spending that's taking place in their state as a result of their voting behaviors.
Exactly. And who is paying for it? The American middle class. Because if you let the Trump tax cut expire, those are the folks who are going to pay more. And really, I make this mistake all the time. I keep calling it the Trump tax cut. It was really the Trump tax reform because, again, not everyone got their taxes cut. If you're one of those high income earners in a high tax location, you paid more in taxes.
Yes.
As you should. Why should everyone else subsidize you and your state's profligate spending?
Right, and you're trying to evade paying the taxes in the state that's spending outrageous sums of money. It's wild. All right, thank you very much, EJ Antoni, as always, for your clear-eyed analysis of everything economic. Thank you, sir. Good to talk to you.